Katalina Kopka, who joins us from the University of Bremen. Katalina is a PhD candidate in the English department at the University of Germany, where she's also lecturer of English-speaking cultures. Her research interests include film studies, science and literature, trauma studies like Gothic and gender studies. Currently, she is working on her dissertation about the ethics of artificial intelligence in contemporary science fiction films. And not so surprising, I guess, her talk will also deal with that topic, and it's titled Beyond the Frankenstein Complex, Pop Culture Representations of AI in the Digital Age. Welcome, Katalina, and great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. Also special thanks to Michael for hosting this panel, and also to my wonderful co-contributors. I'm very much looking forward to all these exciting talks in our panel today. All right, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you so you can all take part in my presentation, which is entitled, as Michael just said, Beyond the Frankenstein Complex, Pop Culture Representations of Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age. Now, I would like to start with a question. What image first pops into your head when you hear the words artificial intelligence? There is a fair chance that many of you thought of either this example or this, HAL from Space Odyssey, or the Terminator T-800 model from the Terminator franchise. Two features are noticeable about both of these examples. First, they present highly sophisticated forms of AI with anthropomorphous qualities, that is, a human body and/or a human voice. Secondly, they want to destroy humankind. In this respect, HAL 9000 and T-800 are in good company. Both of these features are very common in pop culture representations of artificial intelligence, and especially in film, which I'm mostly going to focus on today. Since most narratives rely on individualized characters that invite readers' sympathy or dyspathy, artificial intelligence tends to be portrayed in an embodied form, mostly as a humanoid robot. In the rare cases where AI is disembodied, it at least has a human-sounding voice to enable effective audience engagement. This trend of anthropomorphization among fictional machines is not representative of actual AI research, which mostly produces distributed systems and software-based agents. But these are difficult to portray and also rather unsexy. Instead, then, pop culture narratives tap into a rich cultural archive of story arcs, stereotypes, and tropes of the non-human that have been around for centuries. Ever since the rampaging golem of Prague, Western culture has had a deep fascination with artificial humans. Super intelligent robots are only the latest manifestation in a long line of humanoid predecessors. Incidentally, most of these creations tend to wreak havoc on humankind. The predisposition to depict fictional non-human characters as threatening is deeply ingrained into our cultural fabric. This can partly be attributed to the fact that fiction is driven by conflict, which is why narratives tend to exaggerate existing concerns about the non-human to heighten tension. But beyond the realm of fiction, the continued presence of narratives about artificial humans also indicates a deeper social anxiety. According to Despina Kakudaki, cultural ubiquity is a meaningful sign of the relevance of artificial people who become stand-ins for all sorts of fantasies and desires. Seen from this perspective, the artificial human presents a warped mirror image of humanity's best and worst features, thus allowing for reflections of the human condition. In short, narratives about artificial people are discursive formations that invite societies to debate cultural anxieties about ontological boundaries and otherness. And we heard a little bit about that in our previous presentation. Interestingly, many stories about artificial intelligence exhibit a limited number of themes, predominantly the feared or actual loss of control over the mechanical creation. Science fiction author Isaac Asimov calls this narrative pattern the Frankenstein Complex. It describes the fear of an uprising of, quote, hordes of clanking, murderous robots. The name Frankenstein Complex, of course, pays homage to Mary Shelley's novel of the same name. Frankenstein not only launched science fiction as a genre, but it also generated a plot formula which would be repeated countless times. The mad scientist Victor Frankenstein is led by his hubristic desire for greatness and an obsession with the secret of life. In generating artificial life, he oversteps the boundaries of science. When his attempt is successful, Victor panics and fails to take responsibility for his creation. Abandoned by its creator, the spurned creature eventually starts a revenge campaign against Victor and kills all his loved ones in the process. Thus, we have this loss of control narrative here. The narrative of technology out of control is exemplary for the genre as a whole. In the context of AI, the loss of control is usually induced by heuristic scientists who play God, as we could also see in the case of Westworld, a system malfunction that causes the machines to run amok, or the development of highly advanced machine consciousness, for instance, superintelligence. Yet AI is not always depicted in dystopian settings. Some science fiction also taps into the utopian potential of intelligent machines. In a recent studies, Stephen Cave and Kanta Dihal have identified 4 central dichotomies in AI narratives that reflect the dominant cultural hopes and anxieties attached to technology. When seen in a positive light, AI might facilitate human immortality, allow us a life of more ease, gratify our desires for social contacts, and increase military dominance. However, these utopian dreams can also reverse into dystopian nightmares. AI might turn us into inhuman cyborgs, make humans obsolete, alienate us from other human beings, or worst of all, it might become too powerful and overthrow humankind. Cave and Dihal argue, quote, that the extent to which the relevant humans believe they are in control of the AI determines whether they consider the future prospect utopian or dystopian, unquote. In other words, AI narratives are ambivalent in their representation of technology. The turn of the 21st century marks an important turning point in this regard. The increasing real-life presence of AI coincides with a growing number of stories that portray human-machine relationships and their impact on the social fabric in a more positive light. In these stories, AI is non-threatening and interacts as a friend, a lover, or companion. Examples for this narrative pattern include Kazuo Ishiguro's novel Clara and the Sun, Spike Jonze's rom-com Her, and Maria Schrader's 2021 film I'm Your Man. Yet the AI as threat narrative also continues throughout the digital age. Prime examples are presented in Grant Sputor's sci-fi flick I Am Mother, HBO's hit show Westworld, and Alex Garland's already iconic psychological thriller Ex Machina. So we might now ask ourselves the questions, why is the representation of AI important? To begin with, science fiction and science always have had a relationship of productive cross-pollination, and we heard a little bit more about that today in our keynote speech. Scientific realities inform and inspire writers of fiction, which people who grow up reading science fiction later work, for the people who grow up reading science fiction and later work in STEM. And some of these people try to emulate the things they read about. Thus, the current portrayal of AI might raise unrealistic expectations in future scientists and blind them to the real problems. In addition, fictional narratives matter because they influence public discourses. Pop culture form and serve as a cultural arena in which opinions on AI can be negotiated and contested. It is therefore highly relevant how artificial intelligence is portrayed. At present, the strong focus on sophisticated humanoid robots distorts the public image of AI. Pop culture narratives about artificial intelligence mostly deal with two themes. First, they explore ontological boundaries between people and machines to investigate what it means to be human. And second, they portray the threatening potential of technological superintelligence and subsequent robot uprisings. This limited scope of imagination not only pertains to repetitive plot formulas. Cave and Dihal also point out that most AI narratives display a downright shocking lack of diversity regarding creators and protagonists, which are mostly white and male. Commonly, these narrative patterns assume that human-like artificial intelligence is possible and probable, a fact that is actually hotly debated among the scientific community. As a result, they ignore pertinent real-life challenges in favor of CGI robot battles and enticing android characters. In the real world, AI confronts us with very different problems. Humanoid robots are a mere footnote compared to the decentralized algorithm-based AI technologies that are used in most areas of public life, ranging from social services, the criminal justice system, and educational institutions to credit score rating agencies, companies looking to hire staff, or real estate agents. Scientists today investigate how to improve basic technological skills that enable narrow AI to perform specific tasks. They also discuss how to combat algorithmic bias and how to address the diversity problem within the tech sector. They examine the ways in which AI and big tech cooperation affect governance and threaten democracies all over the world. Effectively, society's biggest current challenge is to prevent smart technology from increasing local and global socioeconomic inequalities. Overall, then, pop culture misrepresents technological real-world challenges in the digital age. Currently, most AI narratives contain a strong anthropomorphic bias. They either rehash tales of robotic uprising that are caught up in the Frankenstein complex, or use robot as a mere vehicle to meditate on the human condition. While these pop culture artifacts, of course, have their artistic value, they kindle anxieties about STEM research and evoke ancient fears of technology out of control. Thus, current narratives skew public discourses about artificial intelligence. They create irrational fears of far distant problems that might never come to pass, yet ignore some of the urgent challenges that need to be addressed by designers and policymakers today. As Virginia Dignam explains, quote, responsibility in AI begins with a proper narrative, which enables all to participate in the discussion of the role of AI in society, unquote. Tales that investigate the social impact of AI companions are a first step in the right direction, but they are not enough. Pop culture wields a great representational power, and as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. It is about time we left the Frankenstein complex behind and started telling more diverse AI narratives. A genre as wildly inventive as science fiction should not be afraid, in Captain Picard's words, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katalina. It seems like it's always white men who are at fault, which is, of course, true in a certain way. And they're also uninspired always, but be that as it may. Our next speaker in line is Kimiko Matsumura, who is joining us from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Kimiko is a historian of modern and contemporary art and specializes on the intersections of art and science, primarily focusing on natural history displays and other scientific illustration practices from the 1800 to the present. Her current project, and that sounds incredibly exciting, examines the relationship between nature dioramas and contemporary art as a means to understand institutional power and shifting conceptions of nature since 1945. and her talk is on biotechnology and monstrosity in contemporary art. Welcome, Kimiko.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited to share this work with all of you in a really exciting conversation about these ideas about biotechnology and AI. I think this is a nice transition from Katalina's talk, actually. So I'll go ahead and get us started. Okay. Manhattan is a sea of images. It's a city where one of the most popular tourist destinations features complex advertisements on enormous posters and video screens. In this world of visual stimuli, it's hard to imagine the public could be fazed by additional pictures. But in the fall of 2000, a few rather odd images joined the fray. Three billboards featuring works by contemporary artists were installed at major intersections as part of a public art project sponsored by the New York cultural group Creative Time. These posters sought to explore the implications of contemporary genetic research on our global futures and presented pedestrians with reflections on the role of DNA in our increasingly technology-controlled society. The Farm by American painter Alexis Rockman sat at the corner of Houston and Lafayette. The billboard questioned the future of genetic engineering by imagining its impacts on our food supply. Rockman's visual hypothesis is grotesque: a square cow with extra teats for increased milk production, an especially fat pig with cultivated organs for human harvest, and a naked rooster with 2 additional wings for ease of consumption. Joining the pig on our side of the fence are square watermelons, triangular tomatoes, and a mouse with an ear growing out of its back. These are all casualties of the human desire to maximize agricultural productivity. Rockman's cautionary tale is effective because of his attention to scientific detail. He consulted a molecular biologist for the project and couches his ideas in real histories of selective breeding. But while his terrifying conclusion is rooted in fact, the painting remains a piece of fiction. Using art historical methods of visual analysis and social history, this paper performs a close reading of Rockman's painting to explore how contemporary artists are using science fiction to make political claims. Displayed so publicly, Rockman's image was a highly visible warning against biotechnological modification. I argue that Rockman's didactic approach spoke to the general public's anxieties regarding scientific advancement at the turn of the century, and it points up the important role of emotion in public perceptions of science. Using impactful visual imagery, Rockman's work demonstrates lingering fears of and distrust for scientific innovation, and it provides insight into continued public resistance to scientific developments in the present. Rockman's didactic message is built through iconography, composition, and his hyper-realist painting style, and implies that our desire for advancement and hyper-efficiency blinds us to the horrors we create in the process. The work is incredibly accessible, literally and figuratively. Located unusually close to street level, the billboard was easy to view. Rockman also avoids abstraction or complex metaphors, which can be alienating for everyday viewers. Instead, the monstrous outcomes are instantly identified as corruptions of natural forms. The animals are still recognizable, but their extra appendages and exaggerated bodies shock viewers and grab our attention. Other elements of iconography more subtly reveal just how these creatures came to be. A fruit fly references geneticist T.H. Morgan's Drosophila experiments that uncovered how chromosomes inform heredity. DNA points to James Watson and Francis Crick's discovery of the molecule's double helix structure. Cellular mitosis, the process by which cells replicate DNA to produce new cells, implies the growth of new organisms, perhaps in this case in a petri dish. And an image of an industrial farm recalls how agriculture was streamlined and mechanized in the 20th century. Even without such insider knowledge, it's clear that these scientific elements have informed these mutated conditions. The vignettes punctuate the surface of the painting like stickers on the front of the picture plane and explicate how such monsters could be possible. Despite the outlandish nature of the engineered animals, Rockman is also careful to show these mutants as within the realm of present possibilities. There are references to pets that demonstrate how genetic engineering is already in keeping with the evolutionary pressures humans enact on the world. Both the blue ribbon on the right of the panel and the parakeets sitting on the fence testify to the ways that humans have long shaped animal appearances through selective breeding. The odd Chinese crested dog serves as a reminder of our strange tastes. The rectangular watermelons and ear-bearing mouse are also part of the altered present, seen in Japanese markets since the late 1970s and created in a Boston lab in 1997, respectively. By mixing fact and fiction, the artist blurs the boundaries between the two. If the unlikely mouse is already true, how can we be sure the others do not exist? If we produce bizarre dogs, what stops us from making something even more strange? The farm's diagrammatic composition further enables this sense of possibility by presenting the grotesque transformation as inescapable. The progressive composition facilitates a narrative of unstoppable catastrophe and creates discomfort. Rockman presents three common farm animals at three different moments of genetic change. The viewer observes a steer, a boar, and a rooster as they drift from their wild origins in the left background to their current domesticated appearance in the middle ground, which culminates in imaginary future forms in the right foreground. Rockman draws from the kinds of percussive diagrams that are associated with scientific educational materials. Perhaps the best known of these diagrams is Rudolf Zallinger's The Road to Homo sapiens, which famously illustrates the evolution of man. While Zallinger's model is outdated and highly criticized, it is a touchstone of science and popular culture that offers a way to understand the farm's persuasive mechanism. In both cases, the diagrams are read from left to right like text. They move from a state of nature to culture, progressing through subsequent stages of change. Similar examinations are seen in early scientific photography, such as Edward Muybridge's locomotion studies or Étienne Jules Marais' chronophotographs, revealing subsequent states of motion and breaking down complex processes into singular frames. In each of these examples, change is linear, implying movement from a state of origin to a teleological end. It creates a continuous narrative, linking the past to the future. In doing so, Rockman does not present these animals as merely imaginary. Instead, the composition insists on the inevitability of the outcome. Like Zallinger's illustration, the farm is ultimately an evolutionary picture that visually links the animals together in a sequence of events. And then as an aside, this is obviously the problem with Zallinger's picture as well, as Stephen Jay Gould has argued. It reduces evolution to this neat, linear process, and it implies that these later forms are making progress towards some kind of a zenith. The composition is also highly geometric. Rejecting organic contours or the calligraphic lines found in nature, Rockman's painting is regular and linear. We see strong, parallel lines in the horizon, barbed wire fence, and the modified cow. Fence posts provide regular vertical pacing in the foreground. And the diagonals of the precisely organized soybean field expand across the painting and shoot back into the picture plane toward these perfectly symmetrical hedgerows. This linearity recalls idealized regionalist farm imagery by artists like Grant Wood. Where Wood's landscapes rely on this regularity to provide a sense of order and calm that paints the heartland as the foundation of a nation's character, however, Rockman's farm is overly manicured and dehumanized. The overregulated nature of this farmstead is further reinforced by the crisp, hypernaturalistic painting style and bright, saturated color palette. The exacting attention to light and shadow and his meticulous brushwork enhance the realism of his fictional scene, making the possibilities easier to imagine and believe. The scene becomes a vividly hallucinogenic dream, one that is accessible through clear, readable imagery. Overall, the picture insists on its own truthfulness through its formal elements, creating a surrealist look at a predetermined and disturbing future. Nevertheless, the future Rockman extrapolates from the present is slightly disingenuous, as the genetic engineering in which he grounds his narrative is not really genetic engineering at all. Square watermelons are not mutants, but rather inedible, decorative items forced into shape by restrictive boxes that inhibit their growth. Similarly, the Vacanti mouse's ear was created by injecting cartilage cells around an ear-shaped scaffold, not grown by altering the mouse's DNA. Nevertheless, by linking these examples to symbols of the genetic age, the painting communicates the visual horror of GMOs and rejects human modification of the world around us, scientific or otherwise. Science is placed in scare quotes, the practice of contemporary Dr. Frankensteins, whose experimentation is an abusive and corrupting force that has pushed nature to repulsive extremes. By placing the work in such a public location, Creative Times sent a clear message, not only about the dangers of genetic engineering, but also about the dangers of our complacency. DNA projects were unveiled at a time of rapid genetic insight and advancement. Dolly the sheep had only been cloned 3 years earlier, and in 1999, the ongoing Human Genome Project revealed its first full sequence of a human chromosome. Gene therapy had public successes and failures, saving a 4-year-old girl in 1990 and killing an 18-year-old boy 9 years later. That same year, scientists successfully inserted the fluorescent jellyfish gene into a monkey embryo, showing that we can alter creatures before they are even born. Creating new organisms at a molecular level seemed more possible than ever before and launched a tidal wave of ethical concerns. Publications reporting the changes were always accompanied by ethical discussions and the possible applications in the future for human beings. Reports on Dolly, for example, always included the implications of human cloning. The New York Times article on the event raises the possibility of abuse in the subheading, ultimately discussing a possible market for cloned babies and the cloning of historical people. At the end of the millennium, the LA Times called it the era of genes and dilemmas. The farm validates fears of scientific abuse and reinforces narratives of out-of-touch scientists playing God. Rather than assuaging the public or exploring more reasonable outcomes, Rockman legitimizes our deepest anxieties by making them visually comprehensible and portraying them as likely outcomes of our insatiable meddling. The painting agrees with Dr. Ian Malcolm, the fictional paleontologist from 1993's Jurassic Park. Reflecting on the ethics of cloning dinosaurs, he declares, quote, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should," unquote. To be clear, these concerns are valid. We should all be aware of the possibilities of biotechnology and recognize that there are some boundaries we should not reach. But this work is not built for nuance. The image is distressing. The billboard's rhetorical question asks, "How's life on the farm?" and answers with a circus of organisms beyond organic likeness. If Rockman is picturing our genetic future, as the poster declares, he is also asking us to reject this future and advocate for something different. Consider the fact that the urban target audience for the sign may never see a working farm in their lives. The emotional distress of the image then builds on a pre-existing sense of estrangement from a process that is already fairly opaque. As a result, the work makes an emotional appeal for involvement, if not outright activism. The concern is already there. The image only materializes it in Technicolor. Rockman's painting joins a wave of other visual expressions that push back on genetic futures. Other works in Creative Times' DNA project present similar cautionary tales, showing that artists were more invested in critiquing the genetic age than exploring its opportunities. The other two billboards, for example, explored DNA's technological power and the conversation around biological determinism. And the still from Halika Kak's video, DNA's base pairs are transformed into binary ones and zeros, suggesting our DNA will also be colonized and substituted by digital forms. Are we ready? The sign asks. Nancy Burson's contribution shows a woman with different skin tones and slightly modified features, and reminds us that no matter what we learn about our genes, there is no gene for race. Other important questions were raised by coffee cups circulated at 5 New York cafes. With artist illustrations and leading questions, New Yorkers could ponder the future of designer babies, eternal life, and the commercial ownership of your own genome. Rockman's original painting was also shown in DNA's companion art exhibit, Paradise Now, Picturing the Genetic Revolution. Together, the 39 artists used scientific methods or imagery to examine moral issues in the genetic age, and most were pessimistic in nature. The rejection of positive outcomes in each of these examples overwhelmingly revealed deep public discomfort with the frontier of genetic research. In a review of the show for Scientific American, Jane Hubbard, an assistant professor of biology at New York University, lamented this take. She judged the exhibition to be, quote, feeding on the fears of the public. The beauty of the reality that attracts the scientist's discovery is not brought out as much as it could be. But perhaps that's not the role of art, she muses. But why can't genetic art capture this multiplicity? During Paradise Now's run, news broke that Brazilian artist Eduardo Cax had created a genetically engineered animal in the name of art. The artist worked with a French genetic lab to splice a rabbit's DNA with a green fluorescent protein from a jellyfish. The resultant animal, known as GFP Bunny and affectionately called Alba, purportedly glowed green under blue light. While green fluorescent protein had been used as a genetic marker in other scientific experiments, Cax's specimen served no scientific purpose and was meant strictly as an artistic exercise. Yet GFP Bunny blurs the line between scientific and artistic experimentation, essentially declaring them to be inherently similar in nature. The artist was swiftly accused of playing God by making an animal for no other reason than that he could. For others, Alba forced them to slow down and reflect on the use and meaning of genetic modification. If artists can make designer animals, then we must consider what we are doing when we produce these artificial mutants. Cax suggests that the creation of life through artificial means is already the purview of the artist, but with genetics, we can make these visions a reality. However, no one actually saw Alba. But Cax's experiment still seems to bring Rockman's question full circle. The rapid advancements at the turn of the century, coupled with the possibilities for the near future, demanded more careful consideration. But perhaps these advancements might also prove as harmless as a green fuzzy bunny. Hubbard's comment in her review pointed to the palpable divide between scientific discoveries and the public's perception of them at that transitional moment between millennia. More driven by fear than by curiosity, the DNA projects show that public resistance to scientific technologies, and genetics in particular, were located in imaginary futures born of speculation. We continue to see this dichotomy play out in vaccine resistance, where lingering distrust of scientific motives stokes fears of genetic manipulation and is currently impacting global efforts to control the ongoing COVID pandemic. We must see these resistances as interrelated, as part of a visual culture that has been preoccupied with scientific malfeasance for decades. Rockman's painting is part of this visual culture, presenting a believable science fiction for an audience full of doubt. But if we can recognize the ways images like his trigger emotional responses, perhaps we can take a more measured look at these pictures and at science in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimiko, for this intriguing talk on the forum as a sort of springboard to larger issues in the genetic imagination in a certain way. I guess all four presentations neatly we're in a neat dialogue with one another, not only in questions of post-human anxieties, as the title of the panel was, but also in terms of a number of issues that they touched upon. While I'll give the audience, because no one has the hand up right now already, a minute or two to think about any a question or two. I was wondering, Kat, because you both kind of started and concluded on the role of the humanities kind of when dealing with this type of a post-human poet and the potentials of post-human poetry, whether you might actually argue that in a certain way by, as you were demonstrating anyways, because GPT-3 draws, of course, on the canon, on past and present textual samples and so on, whether you could also argue that it in some way interprets those texts, and hence it's not just a question of authorship, but also interpretation, which I would think is actually a bit more, maybe even more threatening in a certain way to the humanities if you take that in a certain way away from us. So I was wondering where GPT-3 and similar projects might lead to, and whether and how the humanities might actually, find their position in that new field that might be opened up. Of course, it's a huge question. Any attempts at an answer would be appreciated.
No, that's a fantastic question and a fascinating one. And I think one that the idea of GPT-3 and kind of all of its cohort holds so much potential for. In terms of its kind of interpretive heft, I do think that, inherently in kind of reading the body of text that it's trained on and having to use that as formative influence to create even new works of its own, it is in some ways fulfilling an interpretive role, or even kind of like an auto-pedagogic role as a student who's studying these texts and garnering a certain meaning from it. In fact, I think some of the kind of middling humanities and STEM work on it right now, though it doesn't necessarily gesture to the AI as author kind of notion of it, is starting to kind of read it through as, kind of narrative systems made literal, as a kind of digital humanities tool made autonomous for kind of reading and interpreting patterns and patterns in syntax, patterns in genre that, potentially take, trained members of the academy years and years and years to sort out, simply because it can, read terabytes of data that it's stored up in, rather instantaneous terms. So I think, certainly part of that is the threat that some of the academy is facing of, not only unseating the human soul from the idea of kind of emotional or interpretive uniqueness on the part of humans, but the fact that the machines are just so much damn faster, if in fact they are perceptive enough. But I think it certainly holds potential for that. And that's even part of, on the smaller scale, some of what these tech mags are concerned about, of specifically these APIs falling into the hands of bored undergraduates who know that a trained artificial intelligence will read and interpret Herman Melville better than they can anyway, or something along those lines. It is within Gordon.net's kind of public experiments. There are some sections where it tries its hand at criticism of some of these canonical texts. So it writes up some criticism on like Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, things like that. But that's also kind of the crux of, you know, whether or not it can generate kind of new interpretation as opposed to, you know, chewing up and spitting out the whole of, you know, the JSTOR database and just rehashing the same takes in different language. Although that's, you know, I suppose what some academics do anyway. So I think it's a fascinating question. I don't necessarily have a good linear answer for it. I don't know if there is one, but definitely something interesting to keep in mind.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I didn't expect any sort of linear answer to that question. No worries about that. Igor has his hand up, so I'll ask him to ask his question before I take the next one. Igor?
Oh, thank you. I was wondering if the speakers could maybe talk a little bit about how much of the sort of underlying fear that we've been seeing in all 4 of the presentations, how much of that currently, like in current work being put out there, seems to be about the sort of hidden AI and its indistinguishability from more natural or human, you know, going on. So like the Terminator was indistinguishable from humans, and you know, the genetically modified food that's coming to us, I mean, most people cannot tell visually which one is which. So that fear versus the fear of being supplanted, you know, that fear of, yes, this is a poet, that's an AI, and man, they're so much better than any other poets, or they're so much faster, or how much of like the current kind of fear that you guys kind of see in these works fall into those 2 categories, I guess?
Yeah, Katalina, go first.
I'll just go ahead maybe then. Thank you for this wonderful question, because that's also what I noticed with all of our talks, that this theme of threat, science as a threat, more generally speaking, was something that pervaded all of our talks. And I think it often comes back to this old narrative that somehow human control and human dominance is at risk, is somehow challenged by these new technologies, be it through genetic engineering or through AI or other intelligent technologies. That this age of the Anthropocene, you know, the anthropocentric worldview that Aisha also mentioned in her excellent talk, that basically humanity is sort of the center of the universe and the pinnacle of creation, that this thought is sort of slowly being deconstructed, being challenged on multiple sides. And I think the first sort of strand that you mentioned of invisible threat technologies, and there's loads and lots of examples of that in pop culture. Battlestar Galactica, for instance, has these characters which are essentially robots, but they look like human beings and they can't really be told apart. So there's a number of these narratives out there. I think they also all feed into this same human fear of somehow being outdated, of being replaced by something else, which incidentally though aren't really a very recent phenomenon. They have been around for centuries, really. So I think what's quite pertinent here is that all of these different topics that we've talked about are basically attempts to come to terms with maybe a dawning post-human age, or maybe just this idea that maybe humanity isn't the center of the universe. There are other kinds of species, other kinds of life forms that also deserve our ethical concern, deserve our deliberation. And it can play out in 2 ways. So mostly it is still framed in this threatening narrative. But if you look at the work that's been done in critical posthumanism, you can also see a more optimistic reading, maybe that this might also be a chance to save the human race, to extend our circle of moral concern. So this is maybe my 2 cents on this question.
I would jump in right after you, Katalina, because I think actually the thing that's interesting about Brockman and about my presentation compared to the others is that the idea of the human is actually sort of at the periphery of the work. there isn't anyone that's depicted as being human. It's the effects of humanity on the environment, right? And in Rockman's work more broadly, I don't have time to talk about this. He's actually deeply concerned with human impacts on the environment beyond technological impacts. He's interested in climate change and the way that we're affecting other animals. And his ultimate sort of larger takeaway is that maybe we need to be superseded, that we can't be trusted with what has been given to us in our roles as sort of masters of the universe, as you put it, Katalina, and that this idea of humans as having the most control over the environment, over technology, needs to be broken down in order to actually save it. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting sort of counter approach to this, is that the idea that human beings maybe aren't as valuable as we'd like to believe they are, and that the kinds of abuses we enact on the environment are actually evidence for our discontinuity in terms of species survival.
I just want to touch up on something also Katalina mentioned in terms of how we see AI as a threat, because it reminded me of how, like, from an evolutionary point of view, we, as Homo sapiens, we outcompeted a lot of species in their own environments. And with AI, especially in the context of Westworld, AI are a better version of us in terms of mortality, healing, and a lot of other aspects. So it's almost like we're afraid of being outcompeted by something that we've created ourselves. And with the whole idea of the uncanny valley, humans tend to fear something the closer it resembles us, because it touches up on evolutionary ideas of being outcompeted, because we've done that to other forms of other homos, other animals. So part of the threat comes from there as well, because it's something that could, we've created something that could exterminate us. Yeah.
I think that's such a fantastic comment in terms of the kind of evolutionary impulse there. I do think that there's, in terms of the fear that we see, there's really a lot of reactionary withdrawal from the idea of the superiority of the tech that we've created surpassing us. And that in response to the question, I mean, more marginal AI involvement seems to fall within like the more comfortable range of our risk heuristics. We've been rather desensitized to algorithmic invasion, even where we can see it, just in terms of our kind of day-to-day digital kind of latent cyborg lives. So I do think that in some cases, the visible threat is more symbolic in nature, kind of a harm to our own developmental pride. So many of our crops are selectively bred and modified, but they're naturalized. We take them as natural, but we're put off by the idea of kind of farm freak shows, or we're mostly unbothered by Google Docs, predicting our text and editing as we write, as if it knows better. But the notion of, sitting on a board with an AI faculty member is kind of repulsive to us. So I do think that the visibility in some cases, as well latching onto the idea of the way that, that Frankenstein complex has been kind of presented to us as cautionary tales in such kind of vivid senses through our media, might be more alarming to us than what's already going on behind closed doors, closed screens. I don't know.
Thank you, Igor, for that question and the answers. Anna has a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. This won't for Kimiko, but I think maybe the others can just say something as well regarding the text that they've been analyzing. What is the reception, the broader public's reception of this kind of artwork? Because it seems a kind of topics that are quite difficult to convey to a broader public in a way that is somehow detached or just catches glimpses of from the news or knows of something, but cannot really visualize or figure in their imaginary how these things can be represented. So do you think that the visuals and the text and the whole composition of this kind of artwork is understandable, effective? How does the common viewer, the common watcher receive this? And I don't know if then the other ones also can say something about the text they've been talking, even if it's maybe more popular text, so it's a bit easier to reach a wider public.
Sure. So I don't have, street level responses to the billboards and the way that they were presented in New York. The best I can do is with the reviews of the art exhibition that this work was a part of, that appeared in a number of different publications. And you see it, Scientific American published a review, New York Times did a review. They're in a few other kind of platforms. I think it's helpful to think about artwork as a crystallization of a lot of these larger social anxieties, and especially the way in which Rockman is drawing from these pop cultural elements in order to compose the work. So he's sort of cannibalizing these pre-existing attitudes and images and then putting them back toward a public into a narrative that is much more clear and more legible. So something that he says about his practice is that, he's not interested in making sure that someone at MoMA looks at his painting and understands it. He wants to make sure that it is clear and didactic enough for the everyday person. And, in a point in contemporary art where abstraction and metaphor tend to predominate the market, these very figural, very literal kinds of works do speak to people. And when scholars write about Rockman, some of the people who write about his work are actually scientists, because they feel like it is putting into a different kind of interpretive mode issues that they're already grappling with. So like Stephen Jay Gould wrote about Rockman's work a lot, because he loved the way that it broke down this idea of, teleological didacticism. So I think that, by drawing from these common modes of representation and even putting them in a fine art context, we're kind of seeing that dialogue emerge in ways that work at various levels for different kinds of publics, depending on their familiarity with the material.
Thank you.
I might very briefly add here that, of course, as you mentioned, Anna, the films are naturally sort of geared at a much wider public. So I would definitely categorize them as pop culture. But I think also much of what you said, Kimiko, resonated with me, because film as a medium also has this very specific way of engaging, especially emotions of the audience. And I also think, and actually I didn't get to talk about that a lot today, but that's actually something that I really focused on in my dissertation, is to look at how film can actually sort of function as doing philosophy or as making ethics tangible in a way that is different from just reading a paper on AI ethics, for instance. So I think that all of the arts do have a very important part to play in, well, for lack of a better word here, science communication. And that's why I think it's so important to look at how the arts and film and literature also represent STEM research in the current day and age, because they can add this effective layer that allows us to really engage with some really important ethical or otherwise important questions from the field of STEM research, but not just by appealing to our intellect, but also by appealing to our emotion and other ways of engaging with them.
Anna, to answer your question as well, I wanted to go back to what we were discussing with Igor's question about the threat and fear of AI, because the way the third season of Westworld was received by the public was they looked at Dolores as this female, unstable, psychotic AI who wants to destroy everything that has ever hurt her. And it fits into a trope, and the series misleads us with that, especially because the year before that, the ending of Game of Thrones came out, and they utilized the same idea of this unstable, powerful woman who seeks to destroy everything. But by the end, they sort of clarified that it was completely different. But for the first, I think, 7 episodes of the series, everyone who was watching was anticipating the trope of the AI who wants to destroy everything, and it was very ironic for it to be placed into a woman's body. And the way this show sort of surprises us with a different ending plays on the expectations of the public in terms of AI fear and threat as well.
Thank you.
Since we're past time already, I guess it's a closing question, maybe potentially of a more uplifting note, since we have been talking about the anxieties related to technology the entire time. I guess you all know, since at least 2 of you mentioned Frankenstein, of course. I guess most of you, if not all of you, know the Bruno Latour essay, "Love Your Monsters," what's it titled? Why we must care for our technologies as we do for our children, right? So the question hence is, can we love the technologies that we create, or are they so destructive that at the end of the day, are they so destructive that we can't? I mean, after all, Latour in that essay mentions that we should have not abandoned nuclear power, even though we know what happened in Hiroshima just a couple of years back. Yeah, potentially more uplifting. Katalina?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that essay, because I think actually, and also Frankenstein as a key text to all of science fiction, I think Frankenstein is quite often really misunderstood because many people only see it as this tale of hubris, of scientists playing God and technology out of control. But to me, actually, what it's much more about is the question of scientific responsibility. So the creature is not inherently evil. And if Victor would have been a little more forthcoming, the ending might have been a very different one. So for me, this is actually quite a useful parable for many of these other science fiction narratives about AI specifically, is that it's always about scientific responsibility. And it's not that the technology itself is inherently evil, but it's the way that people use this technology. And you can find that time and time again that sort of the reason why things go horribly wrong is not necessarily because the machine has been sort of pre-programmed this way, but it's rather because people who are in charge of it then do something wrong or use it for wrong ends, and that's why sort of catastrophe ensues. And in that respect, I think it also gives us hope potentially to actually have these conversations now with scientists who are working on such technologies. And there's actually a lot happening within the scientific community too, to talk about ethics of research, to talk about scientific responsibility, to improve their scientific communication with the broader public, because I think this question of scientific responsibility is really what drives a lot of these narratives that I've been looking at.
I can hop in too. I think that there are artists who are considering the ways that we can love the things that we create, even if they're not the way that we think they should look or could look. There's an Australian sculptor, Patricia Piccinini, who creates these sort of hybrid animal creatures that tend to look more human than animal. But these are always creatures that are sort of portrayed with a sort of affection, as if they have come into our homes and become part of our lives. And there are also artists who are using AI and tech in ways that are trying to imagine more utopian futures through the way that they expand the presence of our bodies and the way that they eliminate certain kinds of barriers to existing in the world. And so I think that, you know, if we think about these things in historical context, there are different conversations happening now. And I think it's because the way that we're using technology is also changing. And so it's forcing us to think about these things in slightly different ways than we did 20 years ago.
I want to just mention something that Kimiko mentioned, how technology can expand our bodies. And by definition, especially in maybe not as literal as it could be in the future, but technology and AI have become a part of our identities, about how the way, I mean, if you're an Android or an iPhone person, that determines something about your personality. Maybe not physically, but it's not about loving or hating them, but they've become an intimate part of our lives. It's crucial to the way we function, the way we relate to each other. So I hope that answers part of your question.
And just really quick, I really love the idea of kind of conceiving, human and technological products as almost like kind of a parent-child relationship, kind of the issue of teaching your children well. I think AI, even outside of the realm of kind of antagonistic Kubrickian fear-mongering, becomes almost a fear of the deviant child. But if we take it as having the possibility for mentorship and collaboration, and the ability to have it teach us about ourselves kind of refractively, and if it begins to stray off path, have the awareness and accountability to course correct it according to a developed ethics. I think that it holds a lot of potential, particularly if we challenge the idea that some of that fear stems from the kind of latent concern that we won't have the capability to do so, kind of a fear of our own failure as technocultural parents, letting things get unruly and out of hand. So I think it's approached with kind of a parental standard of ethics, of caretaking, of learning, bidirectionally. That's a really wonderful place to kind of approach the relationship, not just the use or use value or infliction of technology, but the relationship with the technology that we do have.
I think that makes for an uplifting and great conclusion to the panel. Thanks to all the speakers and also to Jana for her presence, even though she didn't present the co-authored paper with Aisha. And of course, also thanks to the audience for not only listening to the presentations, but also the questions that you've asked.